Damn it.
Let's see what else. We also survive only on the donations of those who attend our meetings. So we encourage as the basket goes around that the room for love offerings that you find the intersection of the bottom of your heart and the bottom of your wallet and give accordingly. And we allow you to do that by even those who join us only online, because we have a PayPal function on our website, so you can go there and also make a donation. We really do need those, and so we ask everybody to give as best they can, although there is no requirement. Anything else in terms of announcements? I'm not sure. I don't think there is. Carol Louie is going to do the opening meditation, and then we'll introduce our speaker today. Thank you. Oh, you're going to come up and do that, Suzanne? Okay. Susanna Calvert is going to do an announcement here.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see you. So just a reminder that Richmond Ions partners with the Sanctuary of Earth for our spiritual practice series, which is the first Wednesday of every month. And so our next speaker is on Wednesday, May 1st, Stephanie Gleason, Return to Original Principles. She'll be talking about First Nation Indigenous practices. So I hope you'll join us. It is free. We do accept donations very happily as well. And just to remind you that we have a series of classes, workshops, and retreats now. So we're in the middle of clairaudience now. Clairvoyance starts June 11th. and Introduction to Tarot, May 11th. You won't want to miss those. We're also offering series of healing through grief and loss, or healing through relationships. So these are deep dives for us to do, that really important inner work that, when neglected, can tend to make us feel stuck. Also Reiki retreats. So Dan's putting the links to that in the chat. And if you want to be on the mailing list, I'll pass around the sign-up sheet. And for those on Zoom, if you'll just please put your email in the chat, and I'll add you to the class mailing list. Thank you. Carol?
Morning. So as we begin, think about your intention for today, and just be as open as possible from your deepest part of yourself for what we are about to receive. Now take a nice deep breath in, a nice cleansing breath in, and as you let the breath out, let go of any preconceived ideas, any concerns about the day, and bring yourself fully into the present moment. In the present moment is where the magic begins. Now, in this moment, radiate the light that is within you, your inner light. Tap into it with your breath, with your intentions, with your thoughts, with your whole being. And feel your inner light expand, filling up this room with light, creating a sanctuary of light. Feel the love radiating from your heart center, expanding loving energy throughout your whole body and your auric field. Expand your loving energy to fill this room with love. And now allow that love and light to expand beyond this room, unrestricted. Allow it to go out through this city, touching all of your loved ones, anyone who comes into your mind in this moment. And let it expand even further through this whole country and this whole continent. And you might even feel, sense, or just know this light and love expanding through the globe, surrounding Earth with loving light, letting it fill Mother Earth with love and light and joy. And just as we have the James Webb telescope going out further, send your light with it out into the universe, to all beings. And now add the energy of gratitude for everything that has come together, coalesced together in this beautiful universe, this beautiful planet in you, and even in your breath. We are grateful for all that is. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Our speaker today is not a first timer with us. She's presented, I think, on 3 prior occasions, and is one of the most prolific researchers and authors I know of in the area of reincarnation. Has written some wonderful books on that subject. Today is a little bit of a different, a bit of a change of pace, and involves the Beatles, a group that is well remembered by most of us. And when I think of the Beatles, I think of Ed Sullivan, the Beatles, or whatever he called them. And but in any event, they were certainly a cherished group back in the '60s. And as I recounted, I think at the last meeting, I recently ran across one of these internet stories about a timeline slip where a fellow had a fall and hit his head and woke up in another timeline. And in that particular, this was around 2010, and in that timeline in 2010, the Beatles were still together and still making music. And neither John Lennon nor George Harrison had passed away yet. So, different things happen in different places. They were also still using cassette tapes to record music in 2010. So maybe there are parallels of all of us in that timeline that are still enjoying freshly minted Beatle music as of right now. In any event, and I asked Joanne this morning if she was going to finally solve the mystery for us of how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall from the from the Day in a Life song on Sgt. Pepper's. But Joanne is a wonderful presenter. I'm sure we're gonna have some wonderful memories for this day. And so I welcome Joanne DiMaggio. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello, Beatle fans everywhere. Hello. Is that better? Okay. Dan, do you have a clicker to move? Do you have a clicker for the slides, or do I just tell you? I'll just tell you. Right. Okay. All righty. Well, hi, everyone. I saw some names on people on Zoom that I recognize. It's very nice to be here after all this time. So yeah, this is a little bit of a departure for me, this particular book. I normally do reincarnation-related research projects, but this time I decided I was going to do something completely different. So whenever we want to get started. Can you all see from over here? Okay. There we go. We're getting there.
Hello?
Can you just go to the next slide? We could do it this way. That's fine. Okay. All right. So you saw the cover of the book, which I'm really proud of. I thought that was a really neat cover. But I found this quote from Paul McCartney, in which he was had an interview with Paul Rubin, who told Paul that the Beatles' music changed his life for the better. And then Paul said, that he loved that about the Beatles. He said a lot of our influences were really good, sort of spiritual meditation, this kind of thing. I think we laid out a few paths for people to follow, and I think, it's had a good effect on the world. But looking back on it, it was a blessing that people picked up on it and actually helped themselves in their lives. That's a great thing. It's pretty much what this whole book is about. Go to Yeah, so why did I do this book? I mean, like I said earlier, this was a complete. You can't hear me? Okay, can you hear me now? All right. Okay. So why did I do this book? A couple of reasons. I've been thinking about it for quite a while. I was really looking for answers. I grew up in an Italian-American family on the south side of Chicago in the 60s. And I was wondering, based on my background and based on my life there, how in the world did I go from being in this Italian-American family and going to Catholic school, 12 years of Catholic school? How did I then start a whole career as a past life researcher and therapist? It just didn't make any sense to me. I don't think anybody else cared, but it bothered me for some reason. So I thought, I was looking back on all the influences that I had in my childhood, and then I thought, I wonder if my 8 years as a Beatles Fan Club president contributed at all to this insatiable thirst I had for this deeper meaning of life. So then I wondered, well, did they just plant a seed? And that's what my whole research project was about. Did the Beatles plant a seed of spirituality? I was mostly looking into my generation. I'm the original Beatles fan generation, but I was also looking at what was going on with fans that were younger than me. Okay. So there I am, little Joanne, sitting in front of my house in the Bridgeport area of Chicago, which is a very blue-collar, kind of a rough, segregated neighborhood, mostly Catholic. Much of it was comprised of immigrants. There was a lot of crime going on in that part of the city. I always used to say there was a tavern and a church on every corner. So I'm sitting there. My aunt and uncle lived in that house next door. And I remember even as a child, I would look at them and I'd go, who are you people? And what am I doing here? Like, it really bothered me. I thought, I'm not supposed to be here. Like, where are my gardens? There's no gardens here. It's all concrete. So I felt alienated from my neighborhood, from where I grew up, almost from the beginning. Little did I know that George Harrison felt the same way. He said, sometimes I feel like I'm actually on the wrong planet. And it's great when I'm in my garden, but the minute I go to the gate, I think, what the hell am I doing here? So I thought, oh, George, you and I have something in common. Okay. It's all about detachment. He felt detached, and so did I. His friend Ravi Shankar, who taught him how to play the sitar, said of George, it doesn't seem to matter much to him because he was searching for something much bigger, much deeper. It does seem like he already had some Indian background in him. Otherwise, it's hard to explain how from Liverpool, with his background, and then becoming so famous, what reason did he have to get so attached to a particular type of life and philosophy, even religion? It seems very strange, really, unless you believe in reincarnation. Yes, indeed, George. The first book I ever read about reincarnation was The Search for Bridie Murphy by Maury Bernstein. I was an adolescent. This was pre-Beatles time. My grandparents had a summer home in Indiana on Bass Lake, and I loved going there as a child, and I would always have a book with me. So I was reading books about Edgar Cayce, books that were written by Ruth Montgomery, Jess Stern, those people, when I was like 10, 11 years old. This book came out in 1956, so it was earlier than that. It was about housewife Virginia Teague, who under hypnosis claimed to have been Bridie Murphy, a 19th century housewife living in Ireland. I couldn't put it down. It fascinated me. But I put all that aside. On February 7th, 1964, when the Beatles landed in New York, This was in anticipation of their programs on the Ed Sullivan Show. So what made the Beatles so popular so quickly? Okay. Well, I've sort of narrowed it down to the 60s, the Beatles, and the Catholic Church. The 1960s obviously was full of civic unrest, and of course we lost President John Kennedy was assassinated in November of 63. The Beatles came in February of 64. And I think that we were, at least I know for myself, we were so much in mourning. We felt that there was this dark cloud that had descended over the country. But besides that, something very peculiarly special about the 60s. There was a sociological, political, technical, spiritual changes going on. We all knew something was going on, but we didn't quite know what that was. Now, I mentioned to you that I grew up Catholic. So did Paul and George. And I was openly questioning my Catholic upbringing, because it just seemed to me that there were too many questions about, it didn't make any sense to me. For instance, when I was very young, I remember I would walk to and from school, and we would, back then they let us go home for lunch if you were a walker and you lived close to school. So I remember walking home from school thinking, well, what if it's a Friday and I have a ham sandwich accidentally? My mom forgets it's Friday, and I have a ham sandwich. And then when I go back to school and I get in the crosswalk, I get hit by a car and I die. So what happens to me? I thought, oh, I'm going to go straight to hell. Because back then it was a mortal sin if you had meat on Friday, right? So I thought, well, you mean to tell me that a loving God would do this to a little kid? It didn't make any sense to me. A lot of things didn't make any sense to me. And going through 12 years of Catholic school, I had a lot of questions, needless to say. So between and I wasn't the only one, because when I did some interviews with other Beatle fans about whether the Beatles planted a spiritual seed in them, they were saying they were going through the exact same thing. And it wasn't always Catholicism. Sometimes it was, they belonged to other religious groups. But I really do think the death of John Kennedy really made us raw for some kind of a change to happen. 1964 is when it all started. I was one of 73 million people to watch the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. The first diary entry I have about the Beatles is on February 12th. So this is a good 5 days after they first got to New York. But there were some unforeseen things going on in my personal life and within my family. My grandmother died on Valentine's Day, so she died on the 14th. And that triggered a split in the family. Now, don't forget when I say I came from an Italian-American family, that these kind of splits are pretty common. Anyway, so I was looking for solace because if I felt like my family was falling apart, beloved cousins that I had, I was no longer talking to them. I couldn't see them anymore. I was, only 13 years old. So I found my solace in music. And I decided that I was going to start a Beatles fan club because ever since I was a child, I love the idea of networking. I love the idea of bringing like-minded people together. It didn't matter what we were like-minded about, just as long as we were like-minded. So I was trying to fill that hole, fixing that hole, right? So I decided I would do a fan club. I was a good organizer, and even at that young age, I was a pretty good writer. And I knew that I needed something all-consuming so I wouldn't grieve the loss of my family. So this is the basement in my parents' home. Actually, it was my grandparents' home. Love those knotty pine walls. Isn't that cool? Right? So I got every magazine I had, took out all the Beatle pictures, plastered them all over the wall, and that became my Beatles headquarters. That's me sitting at my mother's old Underwood typewriter. It was a manual typewriter. If those typewriters fell on your foot, say goodbye to your foot, because they were really heavy. And well, one at a time, I'm pounding out these newsletters. This is the first newsletter that I did. I named my club the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to the Beatles. Don't ask me why. It wasn't my most shining creative moment, but what are you going to do? There it is. You have to remember, back then there was no internet. We had no word processors. My database consisted of 3x5 cards. And the way I got my members were through pen pals, because a lot of the Beatle magazines would put pen pals in the back of the magazine. So that was my first venture into marketing. I would start writing to everybody that was in the back of the magazine, say, hey, I've got a fan club. You want to join? So this is my next newsletter. Now see how much I've improved? We had nothing to make headlines with, so I just used magic marker. I enlisted my friends to help. It wasn't very professional. I used whiteout to correct my mistakes. More times than not, I didn't bother. I did it on usually on like onion skin. Remember onion skin paper? And then I used carbon paper, and it looked terrible. I mean, it really did. But back then, when you're a kid, you think this is kind of cool, right? Okay. So 2 important Beatle events in 1964. Right off the bat, we had Hard Day's Night in July of that year. That was their first movie chronicling the life, the day of a concert. I saw that movie 13 times. In those days, you could go to the movie theater and you could sit in the theater as long as you wanted. They didn't kick you out after you saw the movie for one time, so I would sit and see it over and over and over again. This is also the movie where George Harrison's first wife, Pattie Boyd, appeared. She had a small part in there, and so we were, as fans, we were introduced to Pattie. In September of that year, there was the first Beatles concert in Chicago. I didn't attend. I just couldn't get tickets for it. And I was very upset. It was taking place at the International Amphitheater, which was 2 miles from my home. So you imagine that I knew the Beatles were 2 miles from where I lived and I couldn't see them. I was very, very disappointed. So here we are in 1965. I think 1965 actually marked the earliest inkling of the spiritual seeds planted by the Beatles. Things that were changing with me. By January of that year, my newsletter, The Beatles Bugle, was now 10 pages long. But I did have problems keeping my friends in the club. I had to resort to bribery for a lot of them to stay with me. But I noticed when I kept all my newsletters, by the way, I still have them. And I went back and was rereading them, and I noticed a pattern starting to emerge, and the pattern was about family, because I used that word family a lot when I was writing my articles. I felt the need to be with like-minded people again, so I tried hosting a meeting, and that didn't work. I bought a mimeograph machine, remember those? Where you had to type the blue stencil, and then you put it on, you put all this ink on the machine, and it didn't do much good. But my membership jumped to 95 people, but only 60 people bothered to pay their dues. And a lot was going on, you could see politically in that time, so we were still in a period of great uproar. And here come the Beatles advocating love as a universal principle. But by May of that year, May of 1965, is when I started getting nasty letters. The fans were there was some grumbling going on. I don't remember exactly what it was all about, but that was the emergence of some negativity coming through. My first Beatle concert was in August 20th of 1965, was it? Yeah. This was at the White Sox park. There were only 37,000 came to the evening concert. That's the one I went to. But because my home was within a mile of White Sox Park, in the afternoon, when they had the afternoon show, I could actually hear the screams all the way at my house. And I remember pacing up and down in front of the house thinking, oh, tonight I'm going to see them. It was a thrill of a lifetime, believe me when I tell you that. I cried during the whole thing. I don't know where I was sitting, somewhere in the grandstand there. But I wasn't crying because I was there. I was crying because I knew my status as a fan club president really meant nothing, right? I didn't get an invitation to the press conference. I didn't get special seats. I didn't get to meet them. But that's my own doing because I really kept a low profile while I was doing my fan club. And there's a reason for that, which I'll share with you a little bit later. So I really did not want to meet the Beatles. I know you think that's weird, but it's true. Okay. However, that year they did a press conference, and my father knew a man named Jimmy who owned Triangle Camera on the north side of Chicago. And my dad was an amateur photographer, and he built a darkroom in our house, and he taught me how to develop film. And so he would go up to see Jimmy to get his supplies. So one time he took me with him, and he told Jimmy that I was a fan. Well, unbeknownst to us, Jimmy had been at the press conference, and he was one of the photographers there, and he took those pictures. Well, he took a lot more than that, but those are the three that he gave me. The ones repeated twice. I always think about my dad because my dad could have been part of Jimmy's business had my grandparents given him the money to buy into it, and they didn't, which meant that my dad could have been at that press conference, which meant I could have been there. Okay. I still have those pictures. They are my pride and joy. The movie Help came out a few days after the concert. That was our first movie in color that we had. It was filmed in the Austrian Alps and in the Bahamas. Little did we know as fans that the Beatles said they were stoned when they filmed that. They said they did it in a haze of marijuana. So right around that time, I'm starting to get complaints from the fans of my fan club that my news is old. Well, as I said, we didn't have the internet. I got my news the same way everybody else did. I either heard it on the radio or saw it in a newspaper. So there was first talk of us becoming involved with the National Beatles Fan Club, which was in New York. 1966 is also the year that George was driven into what they say into the many arms of Hinduism. But before that, John gave a comment about meaning more to kids than Jesus did. He was just really stating fact. But those of you who, like me, lived through that era, you remember the backlash that the Beatles got because of that comment. You know, they were burning their albums. They were banning them, especially in the southern states. It was really kind of ugly. So John, that's the actual quote that John gave. I knew what he meant. Many Beatle fans knew what he meant. And so as president of the Beatles Fan Club, I felt like I needed to defend him. And so I started to write those kind of articles in the newsletter about this is what he really meant. This is not what you think it is. It was just completely taken wrong and out of context. So that sort of cast a cloud over their entire 1966 tour. But it's like I could see there were different times when we would lose a lot of members, where they would leave in clusters, and this was one of them. And so a lot of people said, that's it, I've had it. I can't go any further with him, and so, okay, they would leave. May of 1966, John said he was in a disoriented state. He had heard some Eastern religious chanting. He found a sound that reflected his, what he called his stone consciousness. So that's the year that Rain was released on the flip side of Paperback Writer. Steve Turner, writing in his book A Hard Day's Right, said it was the first Beatles release that suggested new altered states of consciousness, not just in its lyrics, but in the music. So we're going to see a lot more of that. Tomorrow Never Knows is my favorite Beatles song, if you were to ask me. It's John's attempt to create in words a sound and sounds a suitable guide track for the LSD experience. He adopted much of it from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. One of my favorite lines from that is, all play became existence to the end of the beginning. So it was a seed that blossomed into the pursuit of my desire to do reincarnation research, but I didn't know it at the time. Those are the actual notes that from John's writing the lyrics for that particular piece. Come 1967, I was desperate for help because I couldn't keep up the club on my own. So I enlisted some of my friends, but who weren't Beatle fans. So reluctantly, I started running news that about the Beatles using LSD. I hadn't wanted to do that, but I did. So I exposed that side of the group, and I knew it would be controversial. Paul admitted taking LSD in June of that year. It created a PR nightmare for the group. I changed the name of my newsletter to Love and Stuff, and the name of the club to the Beatles Love Association. I did that a lot. I would keep changing the name as if I couldn't make up my mind what I wanted to call it. It must have been very confusing for people. Anyway, when Paul admitted that he had taken LSD, it was another trigger point for a lot of Beatle fans, and a lot of fans left the club. In the fall of 1967, we got Magical Mystery Tour. How many of you saw Magical Mystery Tour? It was wonderful. I loved it. It wasn't applauded back then, but now it's considered an artistic endeavor that was well ahead of its time. It was about a diverse group of people in a British mystery tour. The main character was Ringo and his Aunt Jessie and Buster Bloodvessel. There were a couple of memorable scenes in it. John shoveling spaghetti onto Aunt Jessie's plate. I thought that was hysterically funny. There was some subliminal influences in the movie. The Beatles reached out to all people of all ages. So this was their universal appeal. They looked beneath the surface in lonely, sometimes sad people with their idea of inclusive love. So that's basically what that film was about. And then we come to, of course, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was their 8th studio album. I did not like the sound of the Indian music. There was something about it that I did not resonate to at all. As a matter of fact, it was very, it was like fingernails on a chalkboard to me. So when George's music would come on and it had that sound to it, I would skip ahead. So what happened was Within You and Without You was on that album, and I didn't ever listen to it because I didn't like the way it sounded. But sometime later, I don't know what happened to switch on the switch to tell me, you go ahead and listen to it. When I heard the words are what really got to me. And I thought, I learned a big lesson then. It was that I had to get beyond the sound of it to go to the lyrics, because within the lyrics was the message. And I still to this day don't resonate to that sound, but But the music, the lyrics that George came up with was just fabulous. So 1968, Life magazine dubbed it the year of the guru. By then I was getting ready to graduate high school, so now you can figure out how old I am. So I wrote a column in my newsletter on the wisdom of having gone down the Beatles path, because I was actually questioning it back then. Lady Madonna came out 2 weeks before my birthday. The flip side was The Inner Light. Again, I did not resonate to it because of the sound of it, but the words of The Inner Light are so incredibly powerful, and they would foresee the work that I would be doing in reincarnation. Without going out of my door, I can know all things on earth. And isn't that what happens during a regression session, right? That's what meditation and reincarnation regression is to me. Being able to work with people in their home or in an office area, whatever, and they can go any place on earth. We could travel anywhere on earth as we explore their past life. So as I said, I didn't resonate at all to anything remotely dealing with the Indian exploration that they were on. So obviously, I didn't get why they were going to see the Maharishi in India, and neither did a lot of other fans. When I was interviewing people, they all said the same. A lot of them said the same thing. It's like, I didn't understand why they were going there. What's that all about? George believed India was the origin for the seeds of spirit. It became a catalyst for people's own journey inward. George felt at home, probably, as Rabbi Shanker pointed out, because he had a previous birth there. He had a real affinity for Indian chanting. Out of that particular trip, we got some beautiful music. They learned transcendental meditation, which they continue to use. The two surviving Beatles continue to use to this day. So there was great value in it. There's all kinds of controversy about the Maharishi, which I won't go into right now, but it's in the book. But I know Ringo only lasted about 2 weeks. He said he couldn't stand the food, had to go home. Paul followed him shortly after that. John and George stuck it out for a little while until there was a rumor going around that the Maharishi was making advances towards some of the women there. And I didn't know this, but I didn't know that Sexy Sadie was written about the Maharishi. I never knew that. I was a very naive fan club president. What can I say? Okay. In the summer of 1968, Yoko Ono entered the picture, and then Paul and Jane broke up. Now, you have to understand that Beatle fans back then were very invested in the Beatles' personal lives. So we were as interested in their wives and their girlfriends as we were in them. There were actually fan clubs that popped up for their wives or their girlfriends. So when John decided he was going to divorce Cynthia and go with Yoko, and then Jane broke up with Paul, and then he ended up with Linda Eastman, there was a lot of angry Beatle fans out there, really. And, when I look back on it, we really crossed the line with a lot of the things that we were writing about and saying. Some of the stuff that I wrote back then, when I was rereading some of my old newsletters, I was actually cringing because I was like, oh, how could I have said that? And even now I'm thinking, I wasn't too kind to Yoko at all. And I wasn't too kind to Linda either. And I didn't want the Beatles, I didn't want Paul or John to know any of that. So I sort of kept up with my low profile. I didn't want to send them my newsletter at all. This was the year that Beatles USA Limited wanted to take over all the independent fan clubs. Now, at that time, there were Beatle fan clubs all across the country, maybe 100 of them or so, started by fans like me who just loved the group. And some of them were really, really good fan clubs, and some of them weren't. But the club in New York was under the auspices of Apple Records. So they had all the goods. They had all the beautiful original photographs. They had the latest news. They were publishing books like that. So they were like, top notch. Well, they started a campaign to try and get all the independent fan clubs in the country under them. That meant that we had to give up our independence, and we had to fork over $50 to be a part of the club. They wanted us to all be chapters. I wanted to show you this at this point in it, because this is one of the benefits of having been part of the National Fan Club. They would go to the head of the fan club went to England, met up with the Beatles at Apple headquarters in London, and she sent us. And she said, "Well, I've got this wonderful Christmas present for all of you." And she sent. This is actually mine, my cube. So she said they signed them all. So for years I treasured that cube, and I thought, I have I have all 4 of their signatures, because after all, she went to England, she sat with them, she saw them sign it, she brought it back and mailed it out. There were only, I think, 50 of them, or something around there. Every fan club president got it, and every area secretary, every state had an area secretary. So my husband, who is an avid sports collector, he has a habit of getting his sports collection certified, authenticated. So he says to me, let's see if we can get tickets to the Antique Roadshow when they come to Richmond, and we'll take your Beatles cube and we'll get it authenticated. I said, no, we're not going to do that. Because I was terrified that it wasn't going to be real, and I didn't want to know that, right? So Antiques Roadshow comes to Richmond, and we go, and what do you think? She said they weren't real. The signatures weren't real. So that was just one example of many untruths that were shared from the New York office to we lowly people out in the field in the fan clubs, and it was really very disappointing. But before I agreed to, and this was after I agreed to become part of the fan club, feisty little Joanne, it was the David and Goliath kind of a battle, right? So I thought, I don't want to become part of this group. So I went downtown Chicago to meet up with Jim Stagg, who was a disc jockey at WCFL radio. We only had 2 radio stations that played Beatles music, WCFL and WLS. And Jim had a column in the Chicago Sun-Times called The Stagg Line. So he reprinted my letter, which I know you can't read, but it's clear in the book. He reprinted the letter I sent him saying, hey, these people want to take us over, and I need some help here. And he agreed to help. He did call the New York office. They never called him back. But anyway, I did get him behind us. Okay. So eventually I gave in, and my Little Beatles Love Association became a chapter of the official Beatles Fan Club. And then that morphed into the official Paul McCartney Fan Club. The National Club had, each Beatle had their own fan club. And lo and behold, Paul's was available. And so they said, you want to run that club? And I said, sure. So I switched my club around. Some of my members quit because, I was only going to be publishing information about Paul. So we became the official Paul McCartney Fan Club. And then to sweeten the deal, the club in New York, those people asked me if I would become national chapter director. I guess they thought better to have her on our side than have her fighting us all the time. So they said to be national chapter director, and all the fan clubs in the entire country were under me. And they had to send me one of every picture that they were selling. Whoa, what a treasure. I still have all those pictures. The reason they sent them to me is because I had to make sure no two clubs were selling the same picture. So I had to catalog all of those, and I got on the Apple payroll. They paid me a whole $25 a month to cover my expenses, which it never did. But I could brag that I was on Apple's payroll. I had a real check to prove it, right? So the Paul Club started in June of 1969. Also this year, there was a lot of infighting. This was the year that John and Yoko and Linda and Paul got married. There was still the infighting over them got worse and worse. But I thought, no, I'm gonna keep holding it together. So I had a meeting at the Palmer House in Chicago. Now you gotta remember, I'm a teenager. I'm organizing these meetings, which was sort of unheard of. We had about 200 people show up for that meeting, but we also had some crashers. So, it was kind of interesting. Late in November, George Harrison's single album, All Things Must Pass, was released. And the music from that, to me, was very comforting. It was comforting on a whole different level. Jeffrey Giuliano, who is a Beatles author, when he was talking about George's All Things Must Pass, he said not only was the album a gripping musical masterpiece, but it was also imbued with an important spiritual message. Inspired by George's homespun philosophy, young people everywhere began looking inside themselves for their own answers. And that is so true. Come to 1970. Well, 1970, things started to unravel. The Beatles Book Monthly was published in England. It was, for Beatle fans at that time, the #1 magazine to have. It had all the latest information, and we treasured it. It was interesting because I was watching a Beatles documentary not too long ago, and in it I saw them looking at a Beatles Monthly, and they were laughing. And they were saying, did you know you said this? Did you know you did that? And then I realized that wasn't any more true than anything else that we were getting in the magazine. So it was very disappointing. But anyway, that magazine discontinued. I had another meeting at this time at the Executive House in Chicago. We had 125 teeny boppers. Well, by that time, I was almost 20 years old. I couldn't relate to them. It was the first time that we were seeing the age difference in the fans. So there was the older group that started out with them, and then there were younger ones coming up, and the two were not getting along. Unbeknownst to me, the Chicago Tribune sent a reporter to that meeting. Her name is Terry Schultz. She wrote this column called Our Town, and that's me standing there talking to the group, and she interviewed me, and that's where I said some things, and actually it's in that article, and it's in my book. I admitted that I said those things about, we older fans don't approve of Yoko, and I was going on and on like that, which was so awful. But anyway, that was where we started addressing the difference between the age groups. This is me on my 20th birthday. I am in New York. I am in the near deserted offices of the National Beatles Fan Club. I had gone there to meet with the folks that were running it. They took me out to lunch to the Americana Hotel. I thought I was just something else. I mean, really, right? They didn't pay for my trip, but they, but anyway, that's me with a lot more hair and less weight. Okay, next one. April 1970. This is when Newsweek published an article that said Paul was quitting the Beatles because of personal differences. Of course, we were blaming everybody. We were blaming Paul. We were blaming Alan Klein, who was their manager at the time. We blamed Yoko. We blamed Linda. But this is when Paul released his first solo album, McCartney, and John formed the Plastic Ono Band. So it looked like it was really, really happening. In May of that year, they released the film Let It Be, which I think is going to be re-released soon. Yeah. It was a 90-minute documentary on how the group recorded an album. The older fans watching it could see the tension. We could read between the lines, and we could see the strain on the group. But the younger fans didn't see that at all. So it's interesting how, because you're totally absorbed in that group, day in and day out, and day in and day out, when, we could see the tension. What's interesting about this is that the fans were mirroring what the Beatles were doing. In other words, when they didn't get along, we weren't getting along. When there was tension among them, there was tension among us. It was really interesting the way the mirror was going on. By September, I decided I was going to give up my club, the Paul McCartney Club, and stay, but I was going to stay national chapter director, but I couldn't find a replacement. So it reminded me of that scene from The Godfather, when Michael Corleone goes, just when I wanted to get out, they pulled me back in. That's how I felt. So what happens in 1971 is the Bangladesh concert. Now, the fan club in New York, Apple, said that they were going to get tickets for every fan club president and area secretary. We had to buy them, but they were going to get a block where we could all sit together. Based on that, a lot of fans went to New York thinking there were going to be some tickets waiting for them. And guess what? Once again, they weren't telling the truth. There were no tickets. Luckily for me, I had some friends in New York, and they did get me a ticket. So I was really thrilled about being able to go to that concert. Okay. This is a really blurry, dark picture. It's a picture of Ringo and his wife Maureen coming out of the Park Lane Hotel. This was my first experience being a groupie. I had never, ever, ever thought of myself as somebody that was going to stand in front of a hotel for 8 hours waiting to get a glimpse of my hero, right? Especially when I thought about all the years I had spent working and putting together the fan club and all the things that I had gone through. But I did. I stood in front of the hotel with some other friends in the heat of, August in New York. And I don't know, something happened to me in front of that hotel. I thought, that's it. I've had enough. I'm just not doing this anymore. So, I decided to give up both the Paul McCartney fan club and the chapter, but Paul beat me to it. He withdrew from the fan club. He said, I don't want to be involved with anything that continues the illusion that there's such a thing as the Beatles. But stubbornly, the Beatles fan club did not just disintegrate. They decided to reinvent themselves as the apple tree, meaning that any recording artist that worked for any recording artist that was in Apple, the fan club would cover them. So that meant that they would cover Paul and Linda, because Linda was also signed. So that didn't last very long, though. Okay, Dan. At the end of December of 71, George Harrison saw a copy of the newsletter that his fan club put out. His fan club was one of the best fan clubs in the country. The president of that fan club knew the Harrison family. They had started a fund to a Bangladesh fund. They had a cancer fund for George's sister. They had adopted a child in Thailand. So they were doing a lot of good. But there was something in that newsletter, and to this day we don't know what it was. George read it, became infuriated, and called Alan Klein and said, there shouldn't be any more Beatle fan clubs because there are no more Beatles. And that was the end of that. Some of the ones that had independent fan clubs decided that they would continue, and I gave all of my material for the Paul Club to a woman in Indianapolis. So when I was writing this book and thinking about the spiritual seeds that the Beatles planted in us, I decided I was going to interview some fans who were my age or around my age to see if their career direction, like mine, went in the area of spirituality because of the Beatles. So these are just excerpts from some of the comments that they made. So Deborah said, I did hang on to every word when I first became a Beatles fan, so something surely touched me subconsciously. Otherwise, I don't think I would still be a fan. Rich said, having been raised Catholic and following the faith, I found myself as an early teen questioning some of the dogmas and policies of the church. Catholicism never made sense to me. I was a seeker in search of my higher self. Tomorrow Never Knows was the first blush for me as it opened the door to the esoteric aspect of spirituality rather than the dogma of religion that had become so stagnant for me. I'd been raised traditional Catholic and thus had no real inkling of spirituality. Well, I echoed that pretty much. Doug said the Beatles and other sources led me to a general spirituality and finding truth in all paths. And we have Nan who said, I started meditating more because of the Beatles' ideas and experiences. And then Jeannie, they showed me I could do more than what I was shown growing up. I had mystical experience, but I think that once the Beatles opened that door, I found it was okay to learn more and that my path through life could be different. If I had not been influenced by the Beatles, fear would have continued to run my life. I think that's an important statement because when she talks about the Beatles opening a door, they gave us permission. Those of us that were raised in a little box with a label on it, we felt that there was no other way. And when we met when the Beatles came out, they said, "Oh yes, there is," and go ahead and find it. Oh, here's something somebody that we all know and love said. Their music impacted our spirituality. Music in itself is a spiritual journey for me. Okay. What I was really surprised to see was how many of the fans that I interviewed ended up somehow connected to Edgar Casey's ARE. Nan became the head of Atlantic University. As a matter of fact, she was the director of Atlantic University when I got my master's degree in transpersonal psychology. Joy became involved with the ARE clinic. Rich joined the ARE, and then Deborah was a fellow graduate of AU like I was. This part of the book, I have a whole chapter about soul writing. Many of you may know, or maybe you don't know, that besides my work with reincarnation research and therapy, I'm also an avid soul writer. Soul writing is a written form of meditation, so it's you writing in an altered state of consciousness. I've written books about it. I teach it. Matter of fact, this summer I'm going to do in-depth, deep dive into soul writing. I'm going to do a July 16th through the end of August, every Tuesday at 10 a.m. for an hour and a half. We're going to do some other aspect of soul writing. This is through the ARE. It's all on Zoom. So if you want to ever learn to do it, soul writing in a much deeper level, I encourage you to look at that. But anyway, I have a whole chapter in my book about some famous writers and composers through the ages who have used a method of soul writing in their when they've been inspired to do anything. This includes Mozart and Beethoven, Richard Bach, Even Stephen King has said, when they talk about, well, where does inspiration actually come from? And then they talk about, I don't know, it's coming from somebody's dictating something to me. So that's sort of the whole essence of soul writing. Lo and behold, John's Across the Universe, he said the lyrics came to him while he was in bed. He said the words were purely inspirational, as if given to him. He was writing as if he were possessed, That was a joy to him. He acted as a medium between himself and the source of the inspiration. So that's a pretty good definition of soul writing. The other time he used it that I could find was when he wrote Nowhere Man. He said that came to him from his subconscious in a quasi-mediumistic way. While he was resting, the words and the music came to him seemingly out of nowhere. That's the way soul writing works. He was aware that he was receiving a vision, and he felt compelled to write it down. So those are two examples of John Lennon using a form of soul writing. Paul did the same thing. With Yesterday especially, he said it kind of wrote itself. He said, I just dreamed it. He said, what a gift. He actually feared it was plagiarism at one point, which is a common concern people have when they're doing soul writing, because it's so different from what they normally would write in a conscious state that they think, oh, I must have read this somewhere or heard this somewhere, and I'm just repeating it. And he also used it when he wrote Let It Be. He said it felt, now we know Let It Be was influenced by his late mother, Mary. He was going through some stuff, and his mother appeared to him in a dream and said, Paul, just let it be. So he said it felt like a visitation, and it was, right? The theme, spirit is always with us, spiritual light is eternal, invites us to emotionally connect, to heal our initial spiritual amnesia, to reunite with eternal light. So next time you hear those tunes, you can think of them a little differently. I wanted to see if I could find any quotes from the Beatles on reincarnation or any other metaphysical concepts, because I thought they must have said something that I read or influenced me somehow to go into the work that I did. Because, the Beatles ended in 1972. I didn't pick up on my work until 1987, so that was like a good 15 years later. And this was when 1987 was the year that Shirley MacLaine came out with Out on a Limb. And that was the big wake-up call for a lot of us sleeping metaphysicians. So Shirley, there's a lot about reincarnation in that book and in the mini series. And so suddenly I like, oh yeah, I used to be interested in that pre-Beatles, right? So anyway, I was looking at through all of my, I have about 60 Beatle biographies. So I was searching through them and reading interviews and things like that to see if I could find anything that they said. Oh, okay. So these are some of the songs that actually reference reincarnation. So Tomorrow Never Knows, I already shared that with you. Play the game of existence to the end of the beginning. I want to tell you, I could wait forever. I've got time, maybe next time around. It's all too much, floating down the stream of time, of life to life with me. In the art of dying, there will come a time when most of us return here, brought back by our desire to be a perfect entity. And in circles, soul takes on a body with each birth. We make our date with life and death along the road. The soul reincarnates. So George talked about references to God. Anybody that says the Beatles don't believe in God, here's your proof that they do. John said, I believe God is a powerhouse, like where you keep electricity, like a power station, and he's the supreme power, and that he's neither good nor bad, left, right, black, or white, he just is. Paul said, God is in everything. God is in the space between us. God is in the table in front of you. And then George, of course, we've all got the same goal, whether we realize it or not. We're all striving for something which is called God. For a reunion complete, everyone is a potential Jesus Christ, really. We're all trying to get to where Jesus Christ got. On predestination, George said, many people feel that life is predestined. He says, I think it is vaguely, but it's still up to you which way your life's going to go. So he's touching on the whole concept of free will. On karma, George said, I think that what we are now is a result of our past actions, and what we're going to be the result of our present actions. And John said, it's like what they say about karma. If you don't get it right in this lifetime, you have to come back and go through it again. And then George said, we have no one to blame but ourselves for the situation in which we now find ourselves. But on the other hand, we can earn our way back to daylight in the future through positive actions now. On the subject of meditation, Gary Tillery, who wrote several books about the Beatles' spiritual life, said for the rest of his life, John often turned to meditation to restore himself and improve his creativity. He characterized his use of it as mysticism, but not in a supernatural or religious sense. And then Robert Rosen, who wrote a book about John Lennon, said John believed that if he meditated long and hard enough, he'd merge with God and acquire psychic powers like clairvoyance and the ability to fly through the air. On the soul contract and having a soul family, Eric Myers is an astrologer. He wrote one of the most wonderful books about the spiritual dimension of the Beatles. He said, things we said today, it's hypothesized the song revealed a soul contract, an agreement to remember, a prior intention to reconnect during dream time. Joshua Green, who also wrote several books on the Beatles, said George saw his friendship with John, Paul, and Ringo as a continuation from past births. George said, we were made John, Paul, George, and Ringo because of what we did last time. It was all there for us on a plate. We're reaping what we sowed in our last life, whatever it was. And Paul said, I do often stop and wonder about the chances of the Beatles getting together. To this very day, it still is a complete mystery to me that it happened at all. All these small coincidences had to happen to make the Beatles happen, and it does feel like some kind of magic. Well, we know that they were part of the same soul group and that they had a contract to come together. On the subject of death, this is one of the few quotes from Ringo that I could find. He just really wasn't into this too much. He said, I don't go to funerals because I don't believe in them. I totally believe your soul is gone by the time you get into the limo. She or he's up there or whatever it is. George said, if you can't feel the spirit of this, he was actually talking about John after he was murdered. He said, if you can't feel the spirit of some friend who's been that close, then what chance have you got to feel the spirit of Christ or Buddha or whatever you may be interested in? And then Patty Boyd, again, George's first wife, when she was writing her book, she was talking about the time when their first manager, Brian Epstein, died. She said, already George was full of Maharishi's teachings. There's no such thing as death, he said to reporters that Sunday morning in Bangor, only in the physical sense. And then Paul said, when your number's up, it's up. John had told his son Julian that when he died, if he could, he would send him something to tell him he was okay. And he said it would be a white feather. And Julian did get a white feather some years later, and it's detailed in the book how that all came about. And then Julian actually started the White Feather Foundation. You can read more about that there. John and Yoko were interesting in terms of how they had their fingers on all aspects of metaphysics. They had a full-time psychic and tarot card reader called Charlie Swan. Charlie was on call with them 24/7. He earned his money from what I've read. They use numerology in everyday living. They picked their apartment at the Dakota based on numerology. The number 9 was really important. It appears over and over again. Number 9, number 9. They collected Egyptian antiques, and John was convinced that they were the reincarnation of the Victorian poets Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Yeah. John and Yoko were also interested in the Kundalini energy. So, Kundalini is a form of divine energy. Robert Rosen writes about John's most optimistic, euphoric moods. He thought there was still a chance that the Kundalini energy would shoot up his spine and that he'd levitate off the ground, at last becoming one with God. John tapped Kundalini in flashes. He could reach the 4th level of consciousness located at the heart almost at will. Then he could see the divine light. They were very interested in astrology. They had an in-house astrologer at Apple. Eric writes, John had a pileup of planets in his astrological area of mysticism, consciousness, and transcendence. And Robert Rosen writes, the Lennons ran their lives by the zodiac and Mercury retrograde charts. Well, we can sympathize with that. Really, if Mercury was in retrograde, they would just stay in their apartment. They wouldn't do anything. They wouldn't go anywhere. No. Even if they were invited to a fabulous party with interesting people, they wouldn't go. John followed the British astrologer Patrick Walker's horoscopes in Town and Country magazine, clipping Libra for himself and Aquarius for Yoko. He hated and feared Mercury retrograde. So George sang of being a Pisces fish, and Paul said of being a Gemini, I definitely have this yin-yang thing, ebony and ivory, hello, goodbye. You say yes, I say no. Often I'm playing with that sense of dichotomy. Eric Myers summed up everything by saying spiritual awakening has been compared to a seed that blossoms into a flower. The point is not to leave the personality or seed, but to have it mature and radiate the soulful beauty flowering which envelops and sustains us. And the final quote I have on this topic was written by Murray Silver, who had interviewed George. He said, from what I saw of him, actually he was interviewing, I forgot who it was. It wasn't George. Anyways, from what I saw of George, he was just trying to put information out there and hoping it would take root. He was planting seeds. That's all the man was doing, planting seeds. He was hoping that one day the clues would blossom into something. And they certainly have done that. That's how these seeds blossomed in me. Those are all of the various books that I have written. Soul writing was my thesis when I got my master's degree. It shows you how to do soul writing and how you can apply it to different parts of your life. Your Soul Remembers is using soul writing to access past life information. I do use soul writing at the end of a regression if a client wants it, because it enables you to go a lot deeper. Karma Can Be a Real Pain is about people with chronic illness who want to see if it's rooted in a previous lifetime. I did it to myself again. It was my own version of Michael Newton's research on life between lives. And then Edgar Cayce and the Unfulfilled Destiny of Thomas Jefferson Reborn was about how Edgar Cayce did a life reading on a 2-day-old baby boy and said he had been Jefferson and Alexander the Great in a prior lifetime. I think I spoke to this group about that last time around. My next project, by the way, is going to be on soulmates. It's called Soulmates or Cellmates. Because we're not always, a lot of people think of soulmates as just this romantic attachment, and it's not. If any of you are interested in being a part of that research project, I'm looking for people who have a identifiable soulmate in this life, somebody you know you were with before. It doesn't have to be a lover, or it could be a best friend, it could be a relative, it could be a business associate, a mentor, anybody that you feel has had an impact on your life, whether you perceive of it as negative or positive, doesn't matter. Just that you can measure your life before they came in and after they came in. And you know on some level either you've done a regression or you know that you've been with them before. So I'm doing some research in that area for this book. If you're interested, if you feel like you have a situation like that, I'm happy to work with you. I brought some questionnaires that they need to be filled out first. Then I'm going to go through them, and then I'm going to start scheduling regressions. There's no cost to you. It's just part of my research project. So let me know. If you're interested more about booking a private session with me, either a past life or a soul writing session, you could go to my website. The different kinds of sessions that I do are listed there. You can, it has an online calendar. You can make your appointment right online. And then I do a traditional regression, one with soul writing. And I also do the chronic physical karma. So if you have a chronic problem and you want to explore that, we can do that. And I also do the pre-life planning session and a private soul writing lesson. So I encourage you to look at my website. Everything's on there. I've got a blog. I've got articles and things like that. And so that's it. I thank you so much. I've brought books. If any of you are interested in looking at them, we're going to be selling them over in the corner. And I was just opening it up now. If anybody, we have some time. Anybody have any questions or comments about anything? No? Quiet. Oh, yeah.
Anybody online have anything they'd like to ask Joanne?
Hi. I exercised to music, and I was listening to Hallelujah, Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen.
Yeah.
And I've become a Cohen fan in recent years. And I thought, I wonder if Leonard has anything to say to us today. So I thought I would have him channeled by a medium that I work with. And so we had 6 one-hour sessions, enough for a book. And one of the questions I asked him, I said, it would be so nice if you could write a song for us, send us a song. And he said, we don't do that on the other side. He said, we are muses. And he said, I will be a muse to whoever is amenable to that. But someone has to be susceptible to receiving my energy. And he said, I do help people. And he mentioned Hank Williams Sr. and his song, The Tower of Song, sort of jokingly, and Hank made a cameo appearance. And
Did he say anything about the Beatles?
No, I asked him who his heroes were. Kurt Cobain.
Really?
He said he didn't. He said he just liked his energy. He didn't always like his music, but he just liked his energy. And he loved the jazz musicians because they could just go all over the place, free form.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Can I ask a question on Zoom?
Sure.
I don't know if you can see me. My name is Mike. And my question for you, Joanne, is, did you ever see the multimedia show in Chicago called The Beatles Rise Again? It was around 1978. It was a wonderful multimedia slideshow about the Beatles. And the point you made earlier in your show, in your presentation, was the healing effect that the Beatles had after the Kennedy assassination. They came to the U.S. Ed Sullivan introduced them. And one of the songs they sang was "I Feel Fine." And it was really a healing experience. And I was curious if you ever saw that multimedia show in Chicago, because you're from there.
No, I didn't. I'm sorry.
But yeah, the reason I bring it up is the show did point out that connection between the Beatles arriving and us really being in mourning over the Kennedy assassination and the civil rights movement, and how they provided this uplifting sense of joy that we were able to move into. And I just wanted to thank you for pointing that out at the beginning of your presentation.
Well, thank you for saying that. I do believe it was a really important element. I'm not sure if Kennedy had not been assassinated or the 60s weren't what they were, how that all would have turned out. But I know it had a definite effect on us as fans and our search for some solace and, burying ourselves in their music. So, yeah, I totally agree with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
If anyone else online would like to ask a question, raise your electronic hand so I can see it.
Hey there, I'm Bill. So when I think of the 60s, I always think of the Beatles. There's just something magical about the Beatles in the 60s. And one of my earliest memories is being in the living room. We had this old black and white Sears TV. And my sister came in and she said, "Oh, it's that group I like." And it was them on that Ed Sullivan show. So they're just magic. And they'll always live on. They're perpetual.
It's interesting on my way up here. I live in Charlottesville, so I had a bit of a drive. On my way up, I'm listening to the Beatles channel, and there were kids that were calling in. 9 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, and they were just as enthused about the Beatles as we were. So I think this is just not going to end anytime soon, people. So that's wonderful to know they had that kind of impact. Hi.
Hi. I just wanted to say I really enjoyed this. I was born in 70, and my dad was a huge Beatles fan. Even sang it in the house all the time. And I realized that right before I hit bottom and had a spiritual awakening, I was listening to Let It Be over and over again. And I didn't realize that he had channeled that in, that he had, like you said, the soul writing that had brought it in that automatic kind of channeled way. And of course, Imagine, and I've heard about George Harrison, and I thought, where have I been? It's kind of like Imagine Dragons, where have I been? The music is there to get that message. And I really appreciate that, because I think that really assisted me in that bottom, and then really moving forward in spirituality in the way that I have been. So thank you for sharing all of this.
Yeah, they were definitely a lifeline for a lot of us. So, yeah.
I remember Ed Sullivan introducing a really great show.
Yeah.
And it was kind of unreal. Nothing like that had preceded them on the Ed Sullivan Show. He did introduce Elvis, but the Beatles were another level altogether, right? I mean, it wasn't just how cute they were.
No.
Although they were adorable.
Yeah.
But they seem to awaken a lot of the older generation, along with enticing the younger generation. And I don't know, it was just like a metamorphosis that was going on, and their phenomenal popularity was so much more than just their great music. I think it touched a subconscious level in our culture as a global culture that transcended language barriers, religious barriers, and embodied a creativity that was so fresh and transcendent. And I think the 60s would not have gone as far as it did without them. That they were harbingers. And where we are today is, I think, on a cusp of another quantum phenomenon because of the momentum that they helped to create.
Yeah, it's hard to believe it's been 60 years and we're still going strong. Yeah. Yeah, Lisa.
So I'm a Beatles fan from way back, and I love that you wrote this book. The song "The Long and Winding Road" has been a theme in my life, and that song to me is more about spirit than it is about anything else. The road that leads to your door, I think I see that as the reincarnation, the in and out of us. And so that song has always been like really meaningful to me. But so has the whole experience of the Beatles. And they loom large in my life. I am talking into the mic. So I appreciate all that you have brought to the forefront with this book.
Thank you, Lisa.
I think it's got any Beatles fan should read it.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Back in that's a little too loud, isn't it? Okay. Joanne, back in the 70s, my first wife was a real estate person and sold a waterfront home to John and Yoko down in Matthews County.
Really?
Right. Yeah. She spent. You would, as a fan club president, you would have really loved to have been there because she spent a week with them, riding all over the Tidewater, Virginia, looking for property.
I saw an article in what's the magazine? Virginia magazine.
Matthews County, yeah.
Yeah, about a couple years ago. A couple years ago, I saw an article about their search for a property here in Virginia.
Right.
You're saying they actually bought something?
They bought a property there in '76 or '7.
Did they ever live there?
No, but they would visit there periodically.
That's interesting.
I
learned something new.
But for me, in the United States in those days when the Beatles came along, we had the civil rights movement going on. We had the anti-war movement that was starting, in as early as mid '76, 66. I mean, when the Tonkin Resolution was passed, and then we also had the psychedelic movement in San Francisco starting there, and so I think one of the reasons that the Beatles were such a seminal group was that they sort of somehow, some way developed a resonance with all those strains, and without being specifically tied to any one of them, but they became emblematic for each and all of them, and that's why I think they have had such a lasting influence, at least in this country, and as I say, in other timelines, they may still be going right now.
Yeah. Take me there, please.
So, thank you very much for your presentation.
Tom. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
And Joanne has books over here that she's brought to sell, both this book and also others of hers. She has some wonderful books. I recommend them to everyone. And remember, we have our potluck lunch out in the hallway today, and invite everybody to join, whether you brought a food offering or not. Thank you very much. Next month we will have Sandy Ward, who will be our speaker, who is a very well locally well-known psychic medium, and we look forward to a wonderful presentation from her. Thank you very much, and I guess we're at an end unless anybody online has any more to ask or comment. Anything? Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.